Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead and start recording so that we don't forget and all that kind of stuff. And obviously we'll get participants that will show up as we go along. And so welcome you to our, this is the fourth speaker series for this semester. And today we have Tim Cotton, who has worked in the game industry for quite a while. Worked with him, although we didn't work together directly. I worked with him at Mythic / EA / BioWare / whatever it was at the time. Yeah. And is now one of our resident companies here at the Virginia Serious Games Institute Scripted. Here to talk to you about the metaverse, which is a huge buzzword right now in the industry for good or bad. And the goal of today's talk, whether you're watching and join us today or watch this later, is to explain kind of where it's coming from, what it's doing, all that kind of stuff. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Tim. And if you have questions throughout, use the chat or after the presentation, feel free to raise your hand, etc. But with that, I'm going to turn off my video and my mic, and I'm just going to turn it over to Tim to enlighten us on the metaverse. Thank you, Tim.
All right. Well, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to share my screen. I've got a short deck for you, everybody. We're going to go over it, and let's see if we can make this work. So let's start this from the beginning. All right. Can everyone see this?
Looks good.
All right. So this session is Explain Like I'm 5, the metaverse. So what we're going to be doing is talking about, this whole idea of what is the metaverse more than a buzzword? Is there actually some real development going on here? What does it mean for the future? And also, how do we look at it from the past? And I really like the words explain like I'm 5. I'm a big Eli 5 fan. I'm not going to use 5-year-old words, but I'm going to try as hard as I can to break down the metaverse thinking as simply as possible and citing my sources. And I'll have to put a reference slide in here in the final version. But, I have been at Game Developer Conference 2022. I have a lot of thoughts. I've been writing about those thoughts. So I might as well tell you about me real quick. My name is Tim Cotton. I was, like James said, I worked with him at Mythic. We were on different floors, but we still saw each other and hung out once in a while. I was on the Ultima Online team. And Ultima Online was first made in 1996. And I joined the team later in 2005, building expansions, maintaining the game, and doing the live events. I worked on other games as well in the MMO space. I went on to become a software developer at nonprofits, doing gamification. I went on and did enterprise and blockchain work. And I finally kind of got everything together and said, now seems to be the right time to found a metaverse-centric company with some seed money. And I talked to James, and I'm very thankful that the Virginia Serious Game Institute has accepted us into residency, because we're very excited about mentoring our GMU interns and, bringing them up to speed on practical game development and practical Web3 development. So that's what we're up to right now. And I'm going to define all of this. So I think it's kind of like, let's go ahead and just talk about metaverse. So my objectives, right? I want to explain to everyone why everyone seems to have a very different idea of what the metaverse is, and whether you're Facebook Meta or you're the old guard who have been working on the metaverse since the late 90s and early 2000s, or you're one of those people who points out that virtual worlds have existed for a very long time, actually older than I've been alive. And I'm 40 years old. So I thought, let's talk about those definitions. Let's kind of see if we can come to something of a consensus. And then what does that have to do with blockchain and the whole idea of Web3, and then what are we actually trying to build? Why haven't we been able to build it so far, or have we? Right? And then who's working on it, and kind of what we should expect in the future. Now, I'm not a prophet. I can't see the future, but I think we can make some predictions. And I've been listening to some talks here at GDC 2022, and there's a lot of thinking that I think is very compatible with the idea of how the metaverse is going to evolve. So let's just get into it. Step one, first thing, if you're just wondering, where did the word even come from? It came from Neil Stephenson's sci-fi novel, Snow Crash. And if you haven't read it and you like sci-fi, please read this novel. It's absolutely amazing. It does have the main character is named Hiro protagonist. You just can't get better than this. He's a samurai pizza delivery man in the near dystopian future. And, to them, the metaverse is a very second lifestyle, grid-based virtual world. It's really neat. It's just an escapist fantasy because the real world is kind of terrible. Playing on that, Ernest Cline wrote another book called Ready Player One, and he just took the entire history of video games, everyone from Richard Garriott with the Ultima series up through all the fun FPS games, and he built kind of a hub-based virtual world that could connect to many different sub-games. And that's an example of a style of implementing a metaverse. So this word is kind of loosely defined already, right? You've got one big virtual world, and then you've got one hub world connecting to smaller ones. Both of these are in 3D so far as I've described them. But I want to get into this because, again, opinions differ. And so when I say opinions differ, I mean, when Meta puts out a video showing a cool augmented and VR reality kind of simulation where you have Mark Zuckerberg himself standing in front of his virtual mirror and showing a digital avatar that is like rendering in real time, reacting to him, that's an example of the 3D school of thought. It's the virtual reality side of things with metaverse. Other people, and I can point to Raph Koster, for instance, who was the original designer of Ultima Online and Star Wars Galaxies, and knows virtual worlds inside and out from the original MUD multi-user dungeon days. He's of the strong opinion that 3D is good for the metaverse, but it's not required. And in fact, he spent time defining the metaverse in a more broad way. And so you'll hear people come up with various definitions, and you're tempted absolutely to say this one person is right. And Wikipedia had to make a definition, and the first sentence on their site says it's a network of 3D connected virtual worlds. And yet we may disagree. I disagree. So I admit, when I talk with the metaverse with people, I like to argue about it politely, because I do think it is a real conversation, and I'm not going to read these quotes that you're seeing on the screen verbatim, but I will touch on them. So we'll start with Raph's, and his idea is that a game universe is what it sounds like. It's, you're a publisher who has made a game, maybe you're Fortnite, for instance, right? You have your own technology. You have your own virtual world. Many people play in it. You have your own rules. You may create other games on your same platform in which your customers can move kind of seamlessly between them. Instead of a metaverse, he defines that as a multiverse. And then his definition of metaverse is that it's a connection of other multiverses to the real world, which I think there's some subtlety there. That's really important. When you take any real world aspect, and it doesn't matter if it's like a video chat or it's like walking through an art exhibit where it's just an empty hallway, but you put a HoloLens on and suddenly you can see digital sculptures rendered in front of you. Whatever aspect of the real world that brings itself into the virtual world, that's a good starting place for the metaverse, right? And again, that doesn't necessarily imply 3D. And I want to point out that metaverse thinking isn't new. There have been lots of developers, lots of time, lots of industry put into metaverse research, even back in 2006 with the Black Sheep company, where they funded, I don't know, hundreds of pages of reports on essentially the industry luminaries figuring out what the metaverse would need. And the tech was not there at the time, right? But now we're getting to a point where the tech is becoming more attractive. And so we're going to see this idea about virtual worlds and platforms connecting to each other. I admit, I kind of like a very broad definition in which the metaverse is just digital identity, my digital identity, being able to move and transact across different virtual platforms. And to me, that means if I buy a digital asset like a Bored Ape, which is an online virtual good that has some rarity to it, artificially, of course. If I buy that and Twitter lets me have a special frame on my Twitter profile and show that Bored Ape as my guy, and then I can jump into a game like Second Life and put it up on my wall as a piece of art, that's metaversy thinking to me. So I will talk about 3D for a second. It's undoubtable that there's going to be a ton of 3D work in the metaverse. It's hard because there aren't really standards across various platforms. Various engines don't agree, as is the fun quote. And I didn't make this up, that some engines use Y to mean the Y axis to mean moving forward and backward, and other ones use the Y axis for up and down, right? These standards don't really, there's no metaverse standard for 3D. So everyone has a different idea about it. But I think we'll interact with the real world in the metaverse through virtual reality headsets, like my Quest 2, which I love. It is a ton of fun. And the HoloLens 2, which has gotten very impressive. I literally went to the Verse art exhibit here in San Francisco, which is in the San Francisco Old Mint. And as I mentioned before, it's almost a dungeon looking place, brick. And you put on a HoloLens and suddenly all around you on the walls, there are paintings. Every room has moving or interesting sculptures floating around. You can interact with them by kind of gesturing with your hands. And it's kind of mind-blowing to see the text pop up and be able to read the descriptions of the art or manipulate the art or like load it onto your phone if you want to purchase some of the art as, for instance, a non-fungible token. And we'll talk about that stuff. But again, I'm going to caveat, and I'm going to just very clearly say that I agree with Raf Koster's position that while 3D is undoubtedly part of the metaverse doesn't have to just be 3D platforms. It could be 2D platforms. It could be text. There's a lot of things that are more built around the real world interactions, however they may be, and my digital identity and the ability for that digital identity to present itself across different platforms. And so I'm just going to drive that home with what many people have pointed out, that virtual worlds have been around for 44 years in one form or another, whether it's bulletin board systems and text, or virtual games like the one I worked on, like Ultima Online. You'll notice that it is a 2.5D game. It has some like 3D geometry to it, but it's really walking around in a tile-based world. And yet this game supported tens of thousands of concurrent users, and it's still running today. It still has tons of like paying subscribers. I think you can actually play it free to play now. And people love just interacting or exploring or killing monsters in this game, and many others like it. and they invest serious amounts of time into it. And I think the investment of time, I want everyone who listens to this session to remember those words. The investment of time is kind of what we're going to be talking about with how the web has evolved and why the metaverse is important. And so I promised I would talk a little bit about Web3. And because Web3 is kind of the buzzwordy thing that gets tossed around right now. And to kind of explain Web3, we have to talk about how the web itself has evolved over time. And we need to talk about both what's been on the web and how it's been presented to us and how we physically interact with the web. And so we're just going to like assert right now that the whole idea of Web3 Metaverse is that we're adding a new way of interacting with the web. It's an evolution of the web. It's the evolution of the internet. And it's more about immersivity, right? There is this component about Web3 that is really based on crypto and blockchain. And these are very technical and difficult words to understand. And I'm going to break down some of it for the audience. I almost want to, there's a temptation to hand wave and say, hey, look, it just works. Don't worry about it. And I want you to think about that for a second in the sense that I doubt any of us, when we use the internet and we use an internet browser, have ever really deep dived, except for computer science engineers, and researched exactly how TCP/IP, the transmission control protocol, internet protocol, actually works. I don't think anyone's read that spec that uses the internet. You don't need to when you use the internet, right? It's more about what technology has been built to make it easier for you to use the internet. So, like I said, let's talk about the evolution of the internet and the web. So when we talk about Web 1.0, right, there's this idea that the Web 1.0 was like, oh, I have the ability to write HTML. I can do hyperlinks. I can click things. I can make my own web pages. I can host them on my own site. I could set up an email server. Maybe my internet service provider set one up for me, but I had to configure it. There's a lot of personal responsibility with Web 1.0, where you had to kind of learn how to do things yourself and host it yourself. Web 2.0, and that's the really interesting part, went from desktop consumption, right, where we all sitting there using our desktops, and suddenly added a layer where we could access the internet through our phones, which added a layer of convenience, right? So instead of just the initial interaction, suddenly we're in this very convenient access space. And what else did we chase? We chased convenience of services, which led to centralization. Instead of everyone having their separate email services, which, you know, some people still do, a lot of people flock to Gmail or Hotmail, Yahoo Mail, whatever it may be. It took away the 99% of the work for the rest of us, right? When we wanted to socialize with our friends, we went to Facebook. When we wanted to chat, we started using Discord. The big innovation of Web 2.0 was not just how physically we interacted with the internet, which were mobile devices, but also this whole period of time in which big companies managed to centralize those services, which led, of course, to a social connection explosion where we're suddenly, I can interact with my family on one side, and then I can interact with all my friends in LinkedIn. And I mean, literally, I've been here at the GDC navigating the parties and the sessions with, you know, LinkedIn, chatting away with all the people I know. And the real thing to keep in mind is that we didn't like throw away the desktops. We still interact with the internet with the desktops. The important part of Web 2.0 is understanding that we just added an additional way to interact with the internet, right? We augmented the way we interact. We went to mobile, not to replace desktop, but now I have the internet more when I'm walking down the street. The kind of unspoken part, and I really want to call this out because it's important to Web3, is that we, the customers who use these services nominally for free, became the product. Like we, the people, are these companies' product. They sell us ads, they sell our information. That's how they can monetize, right? And so the question with Web3 is, how does that change? So there's several parts to Web3. We already had desktops. We already had mobile devices. What's next? Well, the kind of obvious conclusion is that the next physical way of interacting with the web is going to be with virtual reality headsets or augmented reality headsets and other technologies, of course. Things are evolving. And I want to say, right now, they're kind of big and they're still a little clunky. They look very slick now, but the technology curve has continued to improve. If you think about how big desktop computers used to be, if you think about how big cell phones used to be, you remember those big brick cell phones that were like, I don't know, this, you had to carry them with two hands, they were so big. We are very good at slimming down technology and making it easier to use. We'll see that. And I agree with Jordan Blackman, who gave a great presentation at GDC, that we're not going to probably see that in the next like 5 years, but we will see it. It will happen. It's going to take time. And that's going to give us more immersion in the internet. Instead of us just consuming it on mobile by text, we're going to be able to stand in a virtual world and interact with our friends at a virtual poker party, right? If we want to make a video call during that same poker party, we can, no problem. On top of that, or maybe I think it's better to be saying underneath of that, there's this giant push with blockchain technology to decentralize services. So you remember from Web 2.0, we had a centralization of services with Gmail and the others. The idea of blockchain and kind of the promise of it is that we can fairly decentralize financial services or other computational services. And that's a very evolving field, by the way. It's not there yet. It's mostly money and speculation. Just bear with me on it. The idea is that these people who are using the internet stop being the product of the big companies. Instead, they take a personal stake because they're interested in the products, they're interested in these things that are existing, and they're putting their money into it in kind of like a speculative way. And it's helping those new products grow. It's kind of like this classic bootstrapping paradox, right? When you're bootstrapping a new product, if you don't have a ton of money, you need users, and you need users. How do you get them? Your product has to be great. But on the other hand, you can't afford to make a great product until you have a bunch of users paying you. So one of the interesting sessions I went to yesterday, they talked about how with Web3, with this idea of people taking cryptocurrency like Ethereum and kind of buying in to these games, the game developers are finding that instead of the old free-to-play model from starting 9 years ago, where they make the games free and then they kind of get you on the upcharges to keep playing, they pay a little premium to get a piece of the game, that they can trade later if they want to. And it's just pure speculation. But then those people feel more involved in the game's future success because it's, of course, monetarily of interest to them to do so. So what do those early adopters do? They evangelize the game to their friends and their contacts. They bring in more people. Those people do it too. It's like if one person brings two people and they bring two people, we're actually seeing that happen with Web 3.0 game development, which is somewhat promising for the metaverse because I wouldn't say it democratizes game development, but it makes the customers no longer the product. It makes the customers invested in the game. It makes them stakeholders. And so this slide is just kind of all about, okay, we've talked about what kind of metaverse is going to be built. It could be 3D games, it could be 2D games, but really there's this idea of it's a digital presence, right? That you can interact across these various platforms. Who's building it? How do we get more immersive? how do we get to beautiful immersive 3D worlds? How do we get to cool 2D worlds that support 20,000 people at a time, right? How do we get to places where we have hundreds of thousands or millions at a time? How do we get to things like Raf Koster pitched, where we have stock data like rendered out as terrain that morphs and changes around us as like the NASDAQ is moving around, right? How do we get there? There's tons of companies working on it. I'm not going to read all of these to you. I think it's kind of a good idea to understand that there are broad areas of metaverse development. You know, who has the customer base? Obviously Facebook, now Meta, right? Companies like that who have these large user bases, they're going to be the ones interested in the social graph, like spreading out and keeping their user base involved. They don't want to hemorrhage their users over time as they move to different platforms. They want to be the thought leaders and keep the people in. So who's going to make the fun tech for actually, you know, like interacting with it? Well, obviously we have various game development platforms. We've got Unity, we've got Unreal. Surprisingly, we have things like Roblox. And if you haven't seen the latest stuff that Roblox has done with their user avatar customizations, it is quite stunning. Very Sims-like in its power for being able to layer clothing and other things. And then we talk about digital presence and identity. How do you move things between games, or do you want to? The reality is portability of taking a virtual item from one game and putting it in another isn't really that important, and probably not really a necessary feature. I'll just assert that. But there is the idea that if you have something in one game and you spent a lot of time getting it, whether it was money or time that you put in, or it was like the roll of the dice after working in the game for so long, like adventuring in a fantasy world, that thing has meaning to you. And if you can take it out of the game and put it on a marketplace, that's very metaversey thinking, right? What powers that? Digital currency. And what kind of things represent digital stuff? Well, those would be what we call non-fungible tokens. I won't get too deep into the difference there, but I want you to imagine that of the two definitions of a fungible thing that's digital and a non-fungible thing that's digital, the fungible one is like if I have 50 cents in my pocket and I add 5 pennies to it, it doesn't really matter to me that physically those 5 pennies are different. I have 55 cents, right? That's fungibility. Non-fungibility is I have a sword, a digital sword, and I have a digital shield. They're not the same thing, and they may have very different attributes. One may be, may like have a fiery effect, and the other may have a cold effect. Those are different. Those are non-fungible tokens, and the token part just represents ownership of that thing in a given platform. Tons of people are working on this. Scripted, my company, I strongly believe that NFTs aren't quite good enough yet, that we need more interactive digital assets. That's like the entire idea of this promise of the metaverse, is to have like more interactivity and immersion. So we're working on that kind of tech. So just kind of wrapping up, I just want to state it clearly. I don't expect that we're going to be abandoning desktop and mobile and living in the metaverse anytime soon. I don't think that will ever happen. I think we're just going to add yet another way to interact with the internet. And it doesn't have to be fantasy game worlds. It can be any kind of data that we want to manipulate in new and interesting ways. I think that's going to mean, we're going to be able to change the way we see the real world around us too. The HoloLens is something else, because you can walk up to things physically in the real world, get real-time translations for text that you wouldn't understand in another language. You can you can find out who made the object, if you're at an art museum. There's all sorts of things like that. And I also just want to agree that decentralizing finance, despite all of its risks, and there are many, many risks, regulatory issues, rug pulls, and everything that goes with scammy gold rush behavior, right? Putting that aside, I think it will start to eat the lunch of free-to-play games, and we'll see game iteration and development speed up, because the customers, the players, are going to be more involved in the iterative nature of game development. And I really do think that we're just going to become more connected this way. We're not going to spend our lives in virtual reality, but it will be nice to kind of get that sci-fi futury feel of being able to call my family when I'm in the middle of a distant coding session in a VR mountain setting, you know? Well, that about wraps it up for me. Thank you for listening to this session, and I'll get ready to take some questions.
Thanks, Tim. I think James might have had to step away, so I'll take the questions, and if you guys have questions, raise your hand and I'll help mediate.
Absolutely. Thanks, Jacob.
Yeah. I have a lot of questions, by the way, but I'll wait.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Well, if you have a question, you can either raise your hand or throw it in chat, and I'll convey it, or Tim will see it. But you have my brain going a lot, and I'm excited to share this with my students later. So I don't even know where to start. There's so many things I want to talk about.
That's the problem with the metaverse. Where do we start? It's already started. It's been around for so long.
Yeah, so I think I'll I'll just start at the top of my paper. It kind of goes in order of what you talked about. So you talked about, oh, James is here. Oh, and I'm host. He made me host, but I think he's stepping away. So,
all right.
So there's this idea of like, you brought up an example of the XY axis, like, right? And the first thing my brain said was, well, why can't there just be a JVM, a Java virtual machine, like a thing that says, take it, whatever is given to me, and modify it for this platform or this device. And is that a futile effort to do something like that? Or is that being done in any way?
Yeah, so, okay. Thoughts abound about this, right? So first off, I want to give you a primary example. Roblox is making this their business right now, right? Their entire point is that they've got a scripting language inside of their 3D platform. They set standards and they say, come into our world. You can make your own games and earn some Robux. And they want that to be the metaverse. Meanwhile, Facebook Meta wants to do something similar, where they want to provide the underlying technology and set the standards for it. Other people point out that these companies are probably never going to have one winner, right? We're probably not going to see one publisher win the metaverse. In sci-fi, that happens because it's a very convenient narrative device to have one big monolithic company that's running something. I seriously doubt that will happen. Instead, and again, Ralph Koster, I believe, is right about this, most metaverse problems in design are social and standard setting problems. So instead of having one technology platform that works for everybody, which is probably not going to happen despite best efforts, if we can agree on setting standards, just like we have agreed to set standards for how the internet works, you know, with the Web Consortium and the Internet Engineering Task Force and the steering committees and the entire list of requests for comments that define these things. If we can agree to sit down at a table and start defining out what the interoperability is, I think that has a better future than trying to create one master piece of technology.
Yeah, it just makes me think, like, I remember the web, the browser wars and basically that entire thing playing out, and how the developer was just having to develop for all these different browsers.
Yes.
Then you get the interoperability and everything makes simple. But I guess I wonder if that technology, like, do we have to create brand new standards from scratch, or can we like evolve those standards?
Right. No, and I think that's important too. I think that's a really important point. We talk about the metaverse being an evolution of the web. Who should be guiding the discussion? It is the foundations that have been guiding the web, right? Get them involved with the big social companies, get them involved with the big game development companies and the 3D engine companies. Absolutely. Bring them to the table. Don't let them create their own table. Do you see what I mean? I think that it's important that we respect how those same browser wars actually played out, right? Because no matter how you feel about what happened with Netscape Navigator, right? or that Internet Explorer 5 just ignored tons of the conventions, right? What happened? We ended up, all the browsers, moving towards the standards. We've got HTML5 now, we've got CSS3, we've got extended support for JavaScript, ECMA script 6. We're getting to a place where the browsers are coming to a consensus. And it is maybe ironic that a lot of them have started adopting the same underlying technologies like WebKit, right? But for developers, and I've done a ton of web development in my career, it has been a blessing to have the standards exist to work against and then put in shims when I needed to support something else for a certain time period, right? I think it's better to have the 95% be common and understood and deal with the 5% separate that you kind of have to just play against for a specific piece of hardware or technology.
Yeah. This isn't a question, but in the chat, in case the recording might not have the chat, the library has Snow Crash and Ready Player One if you want to try them out.
And everyone, I really think just for your life, you should read both of those books. And also as a third one, Diamond Age. Everyone should read Diamond Age. But Snow Crash really is an interesting book. And the metaverse plays a part in its overall narrative structure. Ready Player One is the one you want to read immediately after Snow Crash, because it gives you just this beautiful dive into game history and why they designed the Oasis the way they did. I think it's just a fantastic way of presenting how a fictional monolithic entity would create a metaverse.
Yeah. And I'll just make a note for anybody who's out there who says they're just going to watch the movie. The book is great. The movie, I thought I would be disappointed for sure. The movie is great because it's not the same. It's different puzzles in the book.
It is different. Yeah. And awesome. You know what? I totally agree with this. I actually really liked the movie and I love the book.
Yeah.
And I was pleasantly surprised at how well they were able to make the movie, because you can't really turn that book into a movie. And Snow Crash doesn't work well as a single movie. That needs to be a miniseries.
Right. I haven't read Snow Crash, I'm ashamed to say. But,
don't be ashamed.
okay.
It's one of those things where you pick up, you're like, what am I reading? Oh, well, that's kind of funny. Oh, okay. I like this. This is weird. I like it.
I'm going. It's on my list. Top of my list. So far there's no other questions. So I'm gonna hit you up with another one.
Okay.
You kind of, well, first of all, I just want to mention, like, I remember when Web 2 was being defined, which took years and debates and arguments, and kind of we're doing with Web 3, right? And it's interesting because, I don't know, in my mind, it had settled on something that you didn't mention. In my mind, Web 1 was publish, one-way communication.
Get it out there and connect it.
Right, and Web 2 is all like, okay, now people can respond to me really easily, and they don't have to be HTML people to respond to me and stuff, like. And so, I guess my thought on that though is how important is it that we even define Web 3, or that we agree on Web 3 is? Does it matter to you?
I think it's important because I think, and I'm very convinced by this argument. I admit it's kind of a newer argument, and I heard Jordan Blackman make it, and that is that where we've traditionally started out as our own customers in Web 1, and then the customers became the product in Web 2. Now the customers become the stakeholders in Web 3, means that it's not just immersivity for our own personal experience, it's immersivity in the act of creation and maintenance of the internet. Instead of, it's streamlining the ability for the common person who's not technical to have an actual impact on the internet itself. That's what I see as the promise of Web3 and Metaverse as, not just a fancy 3D virtual world where you're, like doing some cool simulation stuff. It's a way of getting people more involved in the actual structure of our interconnected world. And it abstracts all the technical stuff. Let's abstract. The problem with blockchain right now, the biggest problem is not security, or even the kind of scumminess of various speculative offers, right? It's really the user experience. The user experience is not very smooth for people who onboard into a blockchain experience. So if we're going to say that blockchain is at all important for assisting in the decentralization and financing of that stakeholder presence in Web3 and Metaverse, then we really need to make that experience better. And right now, if you want to interact with a blockchain in a web browser, you have to download an app, and that app actually centralizes, like MetaMask, it centralizes the way it interacts with the blockchain in a lot of ways. And there's Moxie Marlinspike gave a great blog article about that to us. We need to push the web standards committees and the major vendors to include blockchain into the base technology that we use to interact with the internet. That's what we need to do. That user experience needs to be smooth.
Yeah, I gotcha. Okay, I need to sit on some more talks from you about blockchain and about NFTs. But
I can talk about that stuff all day.
Yeah. So let's see. I had some other interesting things here. I kind of thought when you talked about Web3 and kind of defining it as immersivity, I kind of found myself hitting a contradiction in my brain. And that was, you also defined like the metaverse as like the real world integrating or immersing into the virtual world, like that combination, right? And I feel like, well, if you're getting immersed into the virtual world, bringing in the real world breaks that immersion kind of.
Right.
Maybe. Oh, in my brain, at least, I'm like, well, how can you be immersed in the virtual world and then bring in the real world? Like,
okay. Oh, okay, I get you. That's a fair question. I think what we're really talking about, is, what do you call that in fiction when you break that sense of illusion that you had, right? You're breaking your immersion when the book
like
just called out some
the
anachronistic thing that makes no sense.
Okay.
We want
Uncanny Valley. Is that what you're talking
right? The uncanny valley, breaking of immersion. I understand your concern. I think I understand it. And I want to kind of posit this. There's many ways we'll experience the metaverse. Some of them will be deep, fantastical, sci-fi worlds that don't exist. And we are not going to want to break our immersion, right? We're not going to want to. The presence of the real world in that may be as simple as copying your facial features into the game, right? That's optional. That's gonna be on this side of the metaverse. On the other side of the metaverse, we're going to have the more augmented reality kind of feel, where when you're, and I think Meta made a good example of this when they did their promo video with Mark Zuckerberg. He's sitting at a virtual table with his Quest 2 on, and he's playing poker with a bunch of animated characters representing different people. And then he gets an incoming video chat call from the real world. He presses a button and it pops up on the poker table, just kind of off to the side. And he says, hey, we're playing poker. Do you want to join us? And, said person says, oh yeah, it sounds fun. And their avatar appears in the game. The video chat closes. That kind of smooth experience of bringing the real world in and kind of folding it in, that's what I would expect from kind of this immersivity feeling. It's not about worrying about fantasy, right? And living in a magical world. It's about smoothly integrating our daily activities into a virtual space, or integrating those virtual activities into our real space.
Almost like trying to not have a distinguishing, like they blend together so much that you can't say when one starts and the other ends. Maybe. That's
a really good way of putting it. And there are many, I've heard several people describe it as a blending of the two kinds of reality, so that they just don't matter. Right. It doesn't matter whether you're currently working on chain or on the metaverse, or whether you're working in the real world. It essentially becomes the same thing. For me, I've used several apps with the Quest 2 and my desktop to code, right? To write code in the metaverse. And it's kind of amazing. And I want to hesitate to say that's in the metaverse, right? Because the metaverse is like this ephemeral thing that we're working towards. But in like on the Facebook platforms, I can sit there with a virtual screen here, and here, And instead of my eyeballs only being able to handle one screen at once, I can turn my head, see what I was doing over here, turn my head and do this. And I don't have to own like 8 monitors in real life, right? I can also have a running like video over here showing my output. It's kind of an interesting idea. The one problem with it is right now, and I want to be fair to the technology, the hardware needs to evolve. Obviously, we're not at retina level visualization in our VR headsets yet. Pixelation is still a problem. It's gotten a lot better, but text has to be a little bit big and unwieldy. We don't have fine point like text that I can just easily handle bulk amounts of data in virtual reality yet. But it is about just enabling those daily activities. It's about blending those two experiences.
Well, I don't want to. I feel like I'm I'm going to ask one more question. And this relates to you talking about stakeholders. And before I read on your slide, stakeholders, it had already gone through my mind from your conversation about shareholders and Kickstarters and things like that. But this idea that, and I think it's, at least in my opinion so far, it seems very optimistic to think that we have that much control. But let's assume we do, right? Then the people who have control are the people who are like putting forth these ideas and saying, I want this, I want that, I'm going to fund this, I'm going to support this. And I wonder if we're concerned about like the metaverse being shaped into this thing that only the types of people that are putting forth those energies, like maybe IT people or gamers, like our metaverse is going to become the thing that gamers wanted, or right? Like, because is it really getting, or if it's not, done by shareholders, and it's decided by Meta, the company, or by Roblox, the company. So I guess the scare is it becomes something bad, and who gets to decide?
Right. So I think humans in general are very tribalistic, right? If there's one thing we've discovered as a modern animal on this planet, is that we love variety, and we love brands, and we love being loyal to things and trying things, right? There are people who won't eat Oreos and they eat Hydrox instead because Hydrox was first, right? But a lot of people eat Oreos. People tend to find a solution that's slightly better and they gravitate towards it. MySpace existed before Facebook, yet Facebook is ended up winning that war very measurably. Why? What was so different, right? Sure, there's a combination of factors: advertising, word of mouth, better tech, better social experience, the inclusion of games into Facebook with Farmville and others by Zynga, things that cause people to want to interact and play with that Skinner box more and more, right? I think your concern is valid that the people who are most able and most wealthy and most interested are going to be leading the conversation and leading the development of these kinds of things. That's not different to, I think, how Web 2 or 1.0 have really worked. Maybe 1.0 a little bit differently because it was more about standards and publishing, but who led the development of Web 1.0? Well, it was universities, and before that, it was the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency from the United States, right? The military had a vested interest in creating this kind of technology. There's always a reason, a non-altruistic reason, to innovate these technologies. It wraps us back to stakeholders. It's not so much that in Web 3.0, the customers becoming the stakeholders mean that everyone gets a democratic vote in how the game is made. That's not what's happening. But it means that they feel that they're enough a part of the community that they stay invested in the success of the game. And so when you end up with the end of life of the game, the developers say that maybe they want to move on. I was at 2 sessions yesterday where this was brought up, and you'll have to forgive me because I can't remember. I think it was Seth. Someone had brought up with his panel. There was a great panel that these people, when they're done with the game and they want to move on, they could turn over the assets, the game code, and everything else to the larger community and have it be managed by investment through a digital autonomous organization, on a blockchain. Now, the feasibility of that right now, very pipe dreamy, understandably. But as technology and kind of the social contracts and the legal landscape improve around this area, I think we'll actually see that happen. So we'll see this interest and investment of the stakeholders. And yes, it will still be capitalistic. There's not a socialist utopia over the horizon for Metaverse. I would always expect there to be high competition, and the risk of it just all being gamey, like with fantasy swords and stuff, sure, that's high. But the moment someone makes a killer app for a productivity suite, they're going to use it. Everyone will want it. It's all about figuring out the unanswered questions about what are these new immersive ways of being productive, right? That's really what you're kind of nailing down to. So I just want to say, yes, in its initial forms, I think it'll be really game related. But the moment someone creates some super useful productivity app, wider adoption, absolutely.
Well, I definitely look forward to talking to you more. Right now, we have no additional questions.
Okay.
We will be posting.
I had a lot of fun with this.
Good. We will be posting the recording on the VSGI website. Maybe Stephanie or Riza, you can post it in the chat real quick. Well, the VSGI website has speaker series, has the upcoming speakers. I think we have a couple more left this semester. So please check that out. And this recording will be posted on that website as well. So if you want to go back and check it out, and we'll be sharing it with other folks as well. So thank you.
Fantastic.
And
it was a pleasure.
Yep. Thank you for talking. And I guess we'll see you next time.
Yeah, see you next time. In the Metaverse, maybe.